Welcome to Untethered to Rooted, a podcast that brings you a collection of stories around grief, healing, and identity. Hear from everyday people how grief and loss shape their identity and how their identity shapes the way they heal and process grief. I'm your host, Dana Daugherty, a licensed psychotherapist with extensive experience dealing with grief, both personally and professionally. And if you want to hear stories with gems and practical tools for healing, stay tuned for more. Hello to all of our listeners today for this episode of Untethered to Rooted. We'll be having a part two to our previous discussion of grief, terminal illness, with a returning guest, Lizzie Anderson. We will be exploring care work around chronic illness and exploring a question that has come up for me, actually, as I attended my own grief group when I had lost my mother. And the grief group, they had split us into two groups. One for those of us who had lost someone suddenly to a sudden and or traumatic loss. And the other group was processing the longer process of people who had someone who they had lost who had a chronic illness, or it was a longer drawn out loss. And that always was a question that came up for me, like, well, what are the people in the other grief group learning? And what am I missing out on that learning? But I'm sure there wasn't just those two groups. There was probably a lot of crossover and overlap. And so we'll be exploring that question as well around sudden loss and processing the longer process and drawn out loss and grief with chronic illness. And so by way of introduction, I wanted to introduce our guest, Lizzie Anderson. Lizzie Anderson is a thresholder, carer, justice lover, and activist, social worker, gardener, therapist, creator, intervener, pedestrian, sister, friend, and neighbor, and probably so much more. And so there are many facets to Lizzie. And so welcome, Lizzie, today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dana. And thank you for reading all of those words out loud. That was a mouthful.
Well, there's so much to who you are. And so actually with that, I want to know and would love for you to share, what are some of your identities that are important to you?
Mm-hmm. So really all of those are important to me, which is why I put them in there. But also I know it's important to locate ourselves and identities that are also about how we look, how people perceive us, power and privilege. So I'll also share that I am a white, queer, cis woman. I have multiple chronic illnesses. I grew up and continue to be middle class. I also am a part water creature. I aspire to swim every day. I'm a double Sagittarius. A letter and postcard writer. Sometimes a big romantic. Those are some other things about me.
I appreciate you sharing that. And I would love for you to also share just what identities do you think will be important for us to know that are connected to or important for what you'll share today?
Yeah. Well, another identity, although I'm just thinking of it right now, is I'm a griever. I'm a big griever. I'm an inspired griever, a life-affirming griever. That's a huge part of why I am here today. Yeah. And I think because we're talking about illness, I will say, I already said, but multiple chronic illnesses, but that is also a huge part of what relates to our topic today, my own experience with illness and loss inside of my experience caring for other people experiencing illness and loss. So very different because I don't have fatal illness, at least not at this moment. But actually, some of the illnesses I have would have been fatal 20 to 30 years ago, based on how things have changed. But that hasn't been my experience. And even yet, there's a lot of overlap between what it's like to understand a changing body, changing systems, the grief and loss that comes along with those adaptations, and the possibility that also comes along with those.
Yeah. Ooh, I appreciate you sharing that and appreciate you sharing just um, how your identities probably also hold a lot as far as setting the stage for being a griever, for being like that particular identity. And um, since you'll be sharing about processing sudden loss and even longer processing of loss with chronic illness, I'm just wondering for you have many connections to this topic today. And so I'm
Mm.
wondering, um, I was going to ask you, what's your connection to this topic today? But I'm wondering if there's one particular identity that you have that really speaks to you in terms of what you want to first share about this topic.
Mm. Well, one of the things that you read, two of the things that you read in my bio, I think, were a carer and a friend.
Yes.
Those feel incredibly related to this topic today because the prior episode that we had that was mostly focused on my dear friend Hanna is related to me, one, because I was there, but I was there because Hanna is a dear friend and also someone I care for as she
Mm,
lives and dies with ALS.
mm,
So, speaking of important identities, um, being present for her illness journey and her death has been transformational
mm,
alongside my own experiences of illness and living with illness and loss with that.
mm. Yeah. I'm sure, I imagine, I mean, just the work that you are doing as a carer and also just your role as a friend to Hannah, and your own perhaps wrestling with your own illnesses as well makes you think about grief a lot more, is my guess.
I think about grief all the time. I feel grief and death obsessed.
Mm,
I've said that before and I believe it's true. And I think there's a lot of ways that could be interpreted. And for me, it just means a really strong fascination, even appreciation of orientation towards those parts of life.
yeah, I was gonna ask, like, what does that mean for just our everyday average listener who's like, wait, Lizzie, you're grief and death obsessed. What does that even mean? Yeah.
It means I find grief and death to be life affirming. I
Mm,
find them to be necessary. Um, I, like I said, fascinated by the unknown of it all, the necessity of it all, the awe, the
mm,
portals it opens up. I've said to myself before, and I'll say here out loud, grief is portals everywhere.
oof,
Everything you see and interact with in the realm of grief opens up so much, so many new worlds, so many possibilities. Something about
mm,
that ripeness and fertility is just so powerful to me.
mm. Is there even just, referencing the previous episode and this episode now, is there a particular portal, since there have been so many, is there a portal that's been opened up for you?
So many. I really think the way that I live has changed the more I've experienced the biggest crushing griefs of my life so far. And
Mm,
those are very personal griefs, but there's also just what it is to live in this world, which is
mm,
perpetual loss, perpetual dislocation, perpetual death. And there is what I would consider to be like a good death and what I would consider to not be. And so much death that happens in this world is from genocide, genocide of humans, genocide,
mm,
ecocide of the world around us in the greater than human world. And so to
mm,
be alive and to live is to be constantly surrounded by our interworkings with grief and with death and with loss.
Mm.
Something I thought of as Hanna started to get quite sick, as I started to feel like being with her and just even moving with her through her space and supporting her body as it changes, is like being with the earth in this way that it's like all of the awe and the gobsmacked beauty of it, and also all the slow destruction and death of it.
Mm.
Something there is absolutely transformational.
Mm. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing the duality of that. In being with Hana, in being with just interacting with her body and the ways in which it's changing. And I love what you said about it's like interacting with the earth. It is. It's like we're part of our like ecological landscape. We are part of that, right?
Yes, we are. And something that Hannah has said, which I so admire her for, and it's so true, she said, I'm not the only one dying. That's such an obvious truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also because we live in such siloed, individualistic worlds, that when
Mm-hmm.
someone is sick and dying, it can feel like the only focus, especially if we're not surrounded by, as I am not in my personal world, mass violence. I certainly am as a resident of this globe, but personal, it can feel like that's the only focus. And that
Mm-hmm.
reminder of, so we are all dying as we are living, but also there's mass destruction and death on an unknown scale
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
time. And that reminder
Mm.
of that perspective, and that being alive is to lose, and that death is everywhere, has been so centering for me.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, I appreciate you sharing that. Um, that's such an important perspective and not, I think, one that always people sit with, and really like sit, and when I say sit with, to reflect on or to be with. I think it's really important what you shared as well about like good death versus a more destructive death. Um, and I'm wondering like what is good death for just our everyday listener who's like, wait, there are good deaths? Like, what do you mean, Lizzie?
Yeah, well, I don't know if this will be kept in or edited, but what if we just let it sit for a moment and people can imagine, what do you, dear listener, think of as a good death? Because for me, whatever you shared is as varied as it is as what is a good life. But
Hmm.
I think a good death, and actually the way I think about justice, if we had true justice in this world, everyone would have good deaths, because death is not the enemy. Death is not bad. Death is necessary, right? It's that equal exchange that we
Hmm.
experience for the joy and beauty of living in this world. But so much death is caused by oppression, toxins, lack of resources. That is terrible. And then also because we're not taught how to die. My friend Michelle King, who's also a part of our care circle for Hannah, asked this question: where did you learn how to die? And I love thinking about that question because I'm learning it now in a sense, but I think I'll be learning it until the moment that it happens. And then maybe again in the next life if that happens.
Hmm.
Because that's not a part of our teaching. That's not a part of how we're taught to be, and even to embrace the idea that part of what life is to die. And good
Hmm.
death for me is what a good life is for me, which is about connection and joy and supported pain, because there will
Hmm.
always be pain. It doesn't have to be the suffering or the violence of how most people, unfortunately, I think, have experienced death, but supported pain, love, choice. autonomy, power, all of
Mm.
that.
Mm. Oh, there's so much wisdom in what you've shared, and I'm wondering, I'm wondering if that is, I almost group this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I like group this under when we are able to have this, to be introduced to having a longer process around loss, when we allow ourselves to actually think about it, not avoid it, um, and reflect on it as not a scary thing, but a thing that's natural, as you mentioned, and also that is a part of life, but also that there could be goodness to it. That's such a important perspective, and I'm wondering if that's the longer processing of loss with chronic illness. Can it happen before the illness, or does the illness spark that process?
Oh, so if I understand your question, does the illness spark the process of being able to see like what transformation could
Mm,
actually bring possibility
yes.
to loss? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, or just
Mhm.
like when can we start thinking about this? Is this
Ah,
something that we,
right
you know?
now. Right now, I used to work
Mm,
for this disability service provider in Pittsburgh, and the person who was the executive director for a very long time would say, if you're not yet disabled and you live long enough, you will be.
mm, yeah.
And that blew my mind as someone who was young, but also experiencing chronic illness, but not knowing many other people who were, and not yet having found disability justice. And in fact, 20 years ago, it's not something that people talked about in that way, the inevitability of it, but
Mhm.
also the connection and the beauty in that we can find, right?
Yeah,
And of
yeah.
course, we know like death is absolutely inevitable,
Mm,
even
mm,
if you die as someone who, rarely, but does happen, doesn't have significant disability or illness, death is
mm,
totally inevitable. And
mhm.
so I am all about now, and I think about it in very practical ways, like write your will. All my friends are tired of hearing me say that, but write your will, have your advance directive. If you're in Pennsylvania, have a
Mm,
post. If you're anywhere else, have an ost with another letter on the beginning of it, which is basically the directions you give should EMS come to your home. How do you
mm.
want your body and your life treated? How do
Wow.
you maintain that consent and autonomy, even
Yeah.
when not being able to speak or share out loud what you
Mm,
want? I think that's just a part of how I think about life, as much power, personal
mm.
power within, and shared power as we can have in every situation is good to me. It's better
Yeah.
to me.
Ooh, what a paradigm. It's like a paradigm shift, right? We all like,
Mm.
there's just so much thinking about, um, through commercials and through what's peddled to us about like how much can we live, how much can we live, and fear or avoidance around death. But actually what I'm hearing you say is like, even thinking about how we want our bodies to be treated through disability that will eventually come, right, through death that will eventually come, um, that we want the same things in that as we want in life. We want choice, we want respect, we want dignity, we want all of those things to be part of that process, part of that experience as we have it and live it throughout life as well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm,
Absolutely.
mm,
And this is maybe a little bit different, but I've been experimenting with this idea that's kind of new to me, but I actually don't think is new for many people around the world. And you might laugh when I say it, but this idea that death is awe, death is an ecstasy.
mm,
I think the reason why it's not new is for a lot of people, I think that's what heaven is. It's not for
mm,
me what heaven, I don't have a heaven necessarily, but I
mhm,
do have this idea that death is this total dissolution of ego and this total freedom that exists beyond our realm. And something about that, I think, in the way that heaven has provided so much comfort for so many people, something about that just provides so much comfort for me. And one of the things we're talking about today, Dana, is really that false dichotomy, although certainly that difference between what it is to experience a very sudden or unexpected death and what it is to experience death that's more conceived of and known and prepared for, like with the chronic fatal illness.
Yes.
And I think what's been so painful for me in my own grieving is many of my most important deaths have been suicides and overdoses until more recently in my life. And for a long time, I didn't know quite how to make sense of, but then what happens next? You just have this really traumatic, maybe painful ending after what was some kind of big suffering, and then what? But really coming to the place that all of that death, no matter where and how it happens, even in the most violent, terrible ways, I think people do eventually get to that death is awe and ecstasy place. None of that excuses like all of the violence and terror that we have in the world. Why so much overdose? Why so much suicide? There's still something really comforting about beings and souls being somewhere held.
Yeah.
So that's my version of what many people have found comfort in terms of the afterlife. But it's meant so much to me to actually get to there. And this is very recent. And I'll say that listening to Laurie Anderson, who's an incredible experimental musician and artist, talk about the death of Lou Reed, who also an amazing musician, her partner for many years. Hearing her talk about his death was the thing that really sent me there. And so I'll recommend that people listen to her wisdom.
Wow. Yeah, what a that's just so well described of thinking about that awe. But also the painful ways in which people exit into the awe. And I think, one thing that stood out to me as well that you shared is that there is this false dichotomy. Maybe that's the dissonance that I was experiencing, right? When I was in that grief group and we were being split in these different ways. And I was like, what if I had an experience that was similar to the people that were in this group who lost someone suddenly? Isn't there something for me to learn from them as well? And vice versa.
Absolutely. The answer
Can
is
you tell us why it's
absolutely.
false? Why do you think it's false?
Okay, this is why it's false. Well, one, I'll say there's a third category, and I think this is actually incredibly common, is that someone is sick in some way, maybe anticipated to die, but their actual death happens suddenly, and maybe in a really scary, awful feeling way.
Yeah.
Whether or not related to the illness, but even if related to the illness, unexpected. I think that's really common. Where do those people go in that breakdown? Right? Because if we talk about, well, someone died having known that they were ill, and then they just die peacefully at home, that's one thing, but that's actually a really uncommon way that people tend to die, especially in our really overly medicalized, medical, industrial, complex culture and world that we live in. Right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing that feels false, is that there's a whole other category. And I do know that there's difference there, though. Like one of the things that I'm really learning with Hanna, and I've also learned with other friends who have passed in the last year or so, and also with two of my grandparents who died in a slower, more sick way versus two grandparents who actually died quite suddenly and in more traumatic ways. I've really appreciated all the ways that I have been able to join together with that person and all the people who care and love for that person and learn together and adapt and grow and be honest and loving and moving and have conversations that plan rituals that talk about how do we process this together, all that anticipatory grief,
Mm.
which is what happens before the actual death happens, but an
Mhm.
acknowledgement of that there's always grief leading up to that.
Yes. Hmm.
Using it almost as this like play therapy or kind of pre-play therapy, if that makes sense. So like a setting
Mm.
where you can practice safely what will prepare us for the inevitable, what will
Mm.
gather us up and then even deliver us to the other side in a place that's more broken and more whole than ever,
Mm.
because we're doing that together. And that is something that I don't know how Hanna will die and what that will feel and look like, but everything that has happened up to this point is not wasted, right?
Mm.
All of it is of value in the other side.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
felt that with other people too. And that feels really important to me. And it doesn't necessarily make it better or worse, but it is different than those quick,
Mm.
unexpected, definitely more pain driven experiences with death, again, from more like suicide, overdose.
Mhm.
Those grieving experiences have felt a lot more feverish to me, and like a different
Mm.
kind of consuming and overtaking, almost like there's nothing to do at that point anymore. And even though like I have a lot of capacity to just like be and experience the world, I'm also a very practical, pragmatic person. And I like something to do. You know, like I'm the person who wants a job at the party. Like, let me cut the vegetables, let me take out the trash. And I feel like there's something about that illness related death and all the preparation
Mm.
towards it that has more of that, like, okay, we're doing something, we're making something happen,
Mm. Mm. Yes.
which of course feels different when someone is gone, but
Mm.
it gives us something more to participate in.
Mm.
And that feels really different to me from just, oh, and now someone is gone. Now they are dead.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's
there's a
so
difference, but I don't think it's this, I don't think it's like oppositional or one is better or worse. It just is an acknowledgement
yes.
of the difference.
That's so important. I'm so glad you highlighted that. I think that's important, that participation piece, right? Because um, grief really is experienced by those who are left here,
Whew, yes, it
right?
is.
Yeah. And
Grief is
so
for the living.
grief is for the living. And so, yeah, there is an additional sense of loss. It sounds like it makes sense with people who experience that sudden traumatic loss. Um, yeah, yeah, that there is this, where is the intention around the intentional participation, the intentional preparation, the where's my piece, where's my role in supporting or helping or um, yeah, yeah.
And
Mm.
that's even best case scenario because a lot
Mm.
of people don't have a lot of support and help in their illness and death. We have
Yeah.
a severe care shortage, professional care shortage in this country. This is
Hmm.
something I'm always learning, but I've been learning it a lot as we've been looking for and then secured professional care for Hanna. It's abysmal. And a big part of that is funding, literally money to pay for it. Unless you are rich, it's nearly
Mm.
impossible. Agencies do not pay well.
Wow.
People burn out. They hurt themselves. They're
Mm.
not well compensated. It's
Mm.
awful. And because of the capitalistic hellscape that we live in, so few family and friends and neighbors can actually come together to care for their people when they're ill
Mm.
because they also need to be caring for children on their own without vouchers for childcare. They also need to be working way more than anyone should have to work to support themselves. There's so little culture and web and connection around care. It's just absolutely heartbreaking. That breaks my heart more than the idea of just that people
Mm.
die. It's that we
Mhm.
can't give them what they need as they're dying because of the built world
Hmm.
around us.
It's almost as if I'm hearing you say that, at least in US culture, that we
Totally.
have not created structure to care for each other while and sustain that care for each other while we are living and also while we have disability and also through death.
Absolutely.
Mm,
And that's a political act.
mm,
Care work is resistance.
mm,
And I'm not just saying it's political to give it value,
mhm,
right? Because it
mhm,
doesn't have to be that to have value. But care work is traditionally thought as women work, femme work, Black work, immigrant work,
mm,
poor work, disabled work, queer work, undervalued in every
mm,
single way.
yeah,
To
yeah.
show up for people in that way, however we can, is
Mhm,
resistance, is political. And I think about this with all of these networks of care that I've been a part of,
mm,
not just around supporting Hanna, but supporting anyone. Because one, there's always the political impact and the social and structural impact that creates the situation in response to and all of that. But also, whatever networks and webs we build serve us in anything that comes next, whether
mm,
it's the protest or the next person who's sick. All of that is
mm,
related.
mhm.
And that feels
Yeah.
really important to me, like earth moving to me.
Mm. This sounds just so, just remembering what you were saying about good death and destructive death. What a factor, right? What a factor to then contribute or not contribute to good death or to more destructive death. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm, mhm, mhm. There's something else that you mentioned as well. Maybe it was a little bit earlier. Yeah, about the people who are in the in between. That going back to the like, why is this false? Um, I was sharing with you about my own experience with with my mom having a more chronic um, illness, terminal illness that she was dealing with for 18 months, and so we had 18 months to sort of do the preparation and think about it, but then the actual um, event that occurred for her that put her into hospice for a very short time of a week, less than a week, 5 days, was just so fast. And all the decisions had to be made so fast. Um, and I imagine it felt like, even though I had this anticipatory grief, right? That short processing of that was, to me, felt very similar to what you were describing with um people who have experienced like processing sudden loss, right? Of just like, oh, there's so many quick decisions to make and there are payments to stop and there are family members to contact and there are all these things that have to happen so quickly in this short amount of time. And so
Mm.
I am, I recognize and I hear that there's this like middle. There's all the people who fall in the middle of that.
Well,
And
I would
sure,
say, Dana,
yeah,
you fall in the middle of that.
yeah. Again, I was like, I had this dissonance, and
Yeah.
so perhaps it was that. Perhaps it was just
Mm.
feeling like, whoa, do I have to choose which grief
Mm.
group to go to? I think I actually qualify for both in some way.
I
Yeah.
think so too. I
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing that
Hmm.
personal detail.
Hmm.
I want to ask you questions, but I
You
think you're
can.
interviewing me. Well,
This
here's
is
a
dialogue.
question. Did a therapist versus therapist is like spy versus spy. Well, one thing I wonder, did you at all anticipate? that that's how the last week or so of your mom's life would be. Did you feel prepared
Mm.
for that in any way, or the melding of those two and two different kinds in quotes of deaths?
Yeah, yeah. I didn't. I could not have, just the timing of everything was so wild. And maybe that leads back to the portal comment, um, about timing and connection with the earth and people and all of those things. I, my mom immediately had she had immediately had a medical event that occurred right after eating. And so she was like eating, and then the medical event occurred, and it was the same weekend, the one weekend where she was living in Orlando, Florida. They had this humongous EDM music, and tons of people were going to the emergency room for all of these, um, yeah, for overdoses and for related um,
Right.
issues.
Yeah.
And as a result, the same MRI or CAT scans that were needed for my mom to figure out what was wrong were then unavailable in a way just that weekend, that same night. Um, and so it was like either she could get the scan or we're gonna put her in hospice. And for me, I was like, oh, I knew hospice was gonna be an eventual thing, but I think it
Mhm.
became more immediate when I realized, like, oh, okay, like how long can we hold out and wait for her to like get a scan to like make sure that whatever is happening like doesn't like can be recouped, or like she can get the right medication that she needs, because they were going to make better decisions based off of
Mm.
that
Right.
scan that she needed. Um, but ultimately, her inability, the system, the hospice,
Mhm.
like there's so many things with the hospital system, the
Mhm.
medical system, not being able to get her in, in this emergent way because there were other emergencies. Like it was sort of like a fight for a lack of
Mm.
machines. Um,
Mhm.
and you know,
Mm.
ultimately, it was like this person, these young people, over somebody who is sick. Um, and that was hard to have to
Mm.
like be like, okay, well,
Mm.
because she can't access this machine for 48 hours because the line is so long to
Right.
get that access to that machine, that
Wow.
it was just like, everything was happening very quickly, like in the
Mm.
meantime, right? Like vitals, all of the
Mhm.
things. So it's just
Mhm.
like we have to make
Mhm.
quick decisions, and consciousness, out of consciousness. Like, and so like asking her what she wants, but she's not got fully aware. And so it was that I could have never imagined that last week, that
Mm.
last 5 days of just confusion, really. Like that's the umbrella, right? Of just like confusion. What was the right decision?
Mm.
What are your wishes? I am very grateful she actually did have an advance
Mm.
directive,
Mhm.
and that was
Mhm.
very helpful for us, as
Mhm.
a compass, because it was like in this particular situation, this was what she wanted.
Mm.
But then there were in betweens, there were things
Mm.
that weren't asked in the advance directive that we
Mm.
were dealing with,
Mhm.
which was like, well, what about this scan? Do you want the scan?
Mm.
Or do you want to go to hospice?
Yeah.
And so yeah, that
Yeah.
felt those were hard conversations to have at the end. I-
Absolutely.
yeah, and I never could have imagined that last week of just what hospice meant. But there was, as soon as we did go to hospice,
Mhm.
and my mom was actually back in a conscious state, an
Mhm.
aware state, lucid. She was like, "Well, honestly, it's peaceful here, and if I'm gonna die, this is the place that I want to do
Mm.
it in." And that for me gave me a lot of peace, like
Mm.
throughout. just being in hospice, right? And I was like, wow, like the that clear moment for us was just, it was clear for all of us that we're like, okay, this is where we're at now. And so when I
Mm,
connected back to portals and time,
mm,
there were so many interesting things that popped up during that time, like songs or people
mhm,
or like funny little things with dates, and like,
mm,
oh, the date that this happened is the date that, like,
mm,
this important other thing happened. And just, many
mm,
people might call this coincidence, but why was it popping up in my life in that moment, in that time, right? And so um that happened a lot. That portal was opened up a lot. That portal was opened then, but then happened a lot in the preceding months, or the subsequent months, of just like, oh, this is a funny little connection, and like, why
mm,
did we have this
mm,
connection,
mm,
and
mm,
this is interesting thing that I've learned, and
mhm,
why is this happening all now? And it was just making sense of
mm,
the world, and it was feeling like,
mhm.
oh, there were just different answers coming to me. Yeah, yeah.
That is so everything, Dana. I don't even know what word to say. It's everything. It's a tornado of everything.
Yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, I think to my listeners who um, hear this, like, you may have this long prep time, but then you also might have this short, unexpected, chaotic time of, are we going to do this? Are we not going to do this? Are we not going to do
Mhm,
this? Or we
mhm,
have to do this, and we have to act on it right now. And if we don't act on it right now, then like things change immediately,
mhm,
and,
mhm,
I think that I wasn't prepared for.
mhm,
But looking
mhm,
back on it now, I'm like, okay, well, like, there are other people in my life that, where
mhm,
I will experience this similar, perhaps, similar situation. And so I
mhm,
feel prepared in some ways now, but it also could be very
mhm.
different.
Yes, but even
Yeah.
just knowing that possibility and sharing that with
Mm-hmm.
people, that's
Mm-hmm.
really, really valuable. I
Mm-hmm.
just hearing you walk through that, I mean, we know each other. I know a lot of the story, but those were not details that I know. And that even gives me more information and even connection to you and knowing that
Mm-hmm.
has been your experience.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you asking that. I think,
Mm,
oh, one question, one
mm,
story that I'll add on to this, and then I will flip it back to you as interviewing you, but in dialogue. But one thing that you mentioned, that about death being part of life, that came up for me as something around this time that was, maybe it was right before, or it was before and also after. I guess. Near us, I live in Seattle, and near us is a salmon ladder. And salmon is very common here in the Pacific Northwest. And
mm,
the salmon ladder kind of brings in salmon who go out into the ocean um, annually, and then they come back, and they're reintroduced into the fresh water that is here in our lakes and rivers. And the latter helps acclimate fish back in, but they all kind of go through this journey out to the
mm,
ocean and
mm,
coming back. And one thing that I had learned about a few weeks before all the immediacy of my mom's passing was when I visited that ladder. They had shared about how salmon actually go out, but then when they come back, many of them die in the same streams and rivers that they were born in,
mm,
and that their death provides necessary nutrients that baby salmon need to be
mm,
able to live. Like that, it's needed. So they have to die in order to provide life into that like ecological system.
mm,
And to me, that was really powerful and also comforting. That it was in that, it was like, this is this natural process that has to occur.
mm,
Um, And also that by salmon coming back and doing that, they actually provide more life to the plants around them, to the young fish around them, to be able to live and survive and go out and do a similar journey. Yeah.
Mm.
And so, yeah, that's what it made me think of when you shared that. And
Mhm.
I was like, I think that that is important, just um, in easing the fear around death. For me, it was like, oh, I don't have to be afraid of this thing that's
Mhm.
eventual, right? And one thing that my mom's the Anglican priest came and priest and friend, and he came and he was like, we all know the date that we're born, and every year we passed the date of our death. We just don't know it.
Mm.
And I was like, oh, like that also is sort of life
Mhm.
affirming, where it's like, oh, each day is
Mhm.
actually that potential date, and also
Mm.
each day is important for us to like lean into living.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh,
Hmm.
I love that salmon analogy. Thank you so much. And I
Mm.
think the whole world, the greater than human world, but also the way in which humans are a part of nature is just full of those examples.
Mm.
Inspiring.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And, I think sometimes people take that relationship and the knowing of the inevitability of death as big fear.
Yes.
And I think if you are
That's.
closer to death because of relationship to or proximity to violence, or
Mm.
because of illness, fatal illness, or
Mm.
because of lack of resources or whatever, that is not something that I can completely comment on because that's not my lived experience. But I think
Mm.
for those of us who are not in those positions, we have a lot of choice around how we relate to death. It
Mm.
does not have to be a scary thing to know that that will happen.
Mm.
And
Mm.
was a necessary thing to happen. Even grief doesn't have to be scary.
Yeah. I think that's important that you said that. And I'm wondering, just even thinking about like just ways in which we hold and process, like regular routine ritual ways to hold and process grief, honor grief, honor death. um I'm wondering, especially, I'm thinking about those people who might have those sudden losses. How do people who have sudden loss, how might they get back some of the preparation that they don't actually have?
Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful question. I don't know if I have a great answer, but I'm going to spitball and I want to hear from you too.
Okay.
um, well, maybe part of the answer is we can't get that back, and maybe part of the process is learning to integrate that and be okay
Mm,
with that. Because I think, especially with a kind of death that I have referenced having quite a bit of experience with at this point, like suicide or overdose, there's this really big inclination to say, I could have, what if I
mm,
had called them, or done this, or intervened in this way? That really, beautiful, not to be pathologized, magical thinking that we could have
mm,
done something, right? And as someone who
mm,
has a relationship to the idea of control that I'm trying to shed, but control is a very compelling idea for someone like me. And that idea of like, I could have done something gives us a sense that we have that kind of control in the world. And that
mm,
feels good. Even if we didn't use it in that situation, I'll just do it better and different the next time. And like
mm,
how to walk that line between we don't have that control, but we do have power, ideas around radical acceptance. How
mm,
do we use that power, but not in a way that we'll ever be able to undo the past,
mm,
but we can learn moving forward? And so, not like going back in time, could have done this, should have done this, but
mm,
maybe just how do we integrate that kind of loss Because I do think about grief work and healing as integration. And actually, I think kind of all healing work is an act of integration. Like I did this
Mm.
psychedelic therapeutic integration training, which is just like you aren't, providing psychedelics for the client, but they do psychedelics on their own, and you help walk them through after they have finished that, integrating the information that they've learned. I've been a
Mhm.
therapist for years and years at that point, and then in the middle of the training, I was like, wait, all therapy is integration work.
Yes,
Like
that's right.
all life is integration work. How are we taking
Mhm.
what just is and what we have power in and what we don't, and integrating it into our experience,
Mm.
integrating it into life to move forward with all of that learning and
Mm.
all of that, blessing and all of that hardship that is also a normal part of life. How do we integrate? So, how do we integrate that kind of sudden loss? And that might also be a trauma for some people.
Mhm. Mhm.
There was a
Mhm.
time when I thought of death as trauma, and I actually don't think that anymore because I think of death as, I think some death is absolutely trauma, but just the act
Mhm.
of dying and dying in a way that doesn't involve, um, a, you know, not going to get into all the details of it, but doesn't involve trauma in like a defined kind of way, or the person experiencing the death doesn't actually involve trauma. It more involves this is just really hard, which is
Mhm.
different than a
Mhm.
traumatic experience.
Mhm.
But if we're
Mhm.
talking about a death that involves that level of trauma, whether you are witnessing that or you're imagining the kind of death that your person had,
Mhm.
along with that suddenness and unexpectedness,
Mhm.
that is a different integration process. And
Mm.
for me, I think about grief as a way of having a continued relationship with someone, not just in the like wailing and the deep sadness of it, although I encourage that, but also in the joy of the continued connection with that
Mm.
person. That is all the grief.
Mhm.
So I think of
Mhm.
grief as more expansive, but really having conversations with people who have died, telling them how you feel, all the anger you might
Mm.
even feel, the
Yeah.
sadness you might even feel, honoring their lives and the way that they have moved and changed you, even in the death and grieving process, even in the hardest ways. I think sometimes when people die, or maybe I'll say like in this culture, probably like 99% of when people die, there's this idea that we have to just exalt them. They were the
Mm.
sweetest person, the nicest person, the best person. But I love the stories that include, and they were fickle. Oh no, I said it that way. Okay. And they were fickle and they
Yeah.
were mean sometimes. And they killed themselves without telling me that they were struggling. And I will never
Mm.
get over a part of that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
Stuff like that, like the realness of
Yes.
that kind of loss.
Yeah.
But not letting that be the only way that we continue to relate to them.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think,
Mm.
so I called 2021 my year of suicide because I lost three people that I cared about and had a few other people that were very much on the brink that year,
Mhm.
both
Mhm.
professionally and personally.
Mhm.
And in a kind of like feverish response, I wrote this guide around suicide.
Mm.
It's all I wanted to do in every spare moment that I had. And I think in a way, I'm not judging that as right or wrong. I wrote it with other people. It's a
Mhm.
good thing. I think that's out in the world. Incomplete, only one part of the story, but it's a
Mhm.
reasonable thing that's out in the world that I've heard
Yeah.
people have been supported by. And I
Mm.
think it was also in that effort of like, oh, I am losing way too many people in this way. We are losing way too many people in this way. How do I do something to make it feel like I'm doing something?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that was a response. And even now, as I go through this process with Hanna, and as I go through the process of having lost a few other friends this year, also young people,
Mm.
also from illness,
Mm.
I'm writing a manual on how do we care for people in these
Mm.
situations. And in a way, it's like such a similar response, but it also feels quite different in the sense that it can be much slower.
Yeah.
Like it
Yeah.
feels less urgent,
Mm.
but still a kind of similar way that I'm trying to integrate these different but aligning losses. And now I'm wondering, am I answering the question?
I mean, I love the path we've walked down. I'm what has stuck with me, right, is just um yeah, I mean, we're talking about like, are there rituals? Are there ways we can
Mm-hmm.
learn to hold and process grief? And I think, I mean, you're sharing so many different ways to do that. Even when I think about your earlier comment about um, the ways in which we honor people in life are the ways in which we can honor people in death as well. Like we can honor the
Absolutely.
respect and dignity and choice and agency. Um, and in the way that we may sometimes be like, wow, that was a great birthday celebration. We do that a lot, right? That was great birthday celebration to honor this person. This person's so great. Or wow, this person's been such a good friend and we had such a great chat. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that is like in the everyday,
Mm-hmm.
we are integrating connection and relationship. And
Absolutely.
it doesn't have to start necessarily in death, and it doesn't have to end in death either, right? In the ways in
It
which
can
we do that.
only, absolutely. And actually, it opens up again a portal to a whole
Yes,
new way of relating and
yes,
connecting too.
yes,
And
yes,
maybe going back to that, those like guides and manuals that I've written as I was thinking about
yes.
them and this question, there's a way in which the practical is
Mm.
ritual for me.
Ooh, yeah,
Like, I don't
yeah,
think those things are, it's not like sexy, right? Like, I don't think those things are often combined, but I think it's true. Like, something
yeah.
about really like getting our ducks in a row, making the care schedule,
Mm,
documenting the processes so we can share with people, all of
mm,
that, feeding my beloved who needs to now be fed by other
mm,
people, that
mm.
practical is a part of that ritual of grieving and of integration too, for me.
Yes, yes. I'm so glad you mentioned that because I feel like, I mean, we take for granted the practical. It's not compensated in our country, right? It's not well, at least, right?
Mhm,
Or you have to really go through a bunch of hoops to get it
mhm,
compensated, right?
mhm,
Um, and I just think there's a lot of beauty in what you've shared around the practical is honoring. um, it's in those pieces every day of making the schedule is an act of love, right? It is
mhm,
an act of resistance. It is an
mhm,
act of care. All of those pieces are like intersected at those practical um,
mhm.
actions. Hmm.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. I was going to ask you, any more wisdom you want to drop, but I feel like you've shared so much wisdom already. And I also appreciate the guides that you mentioned that you've written. And I'd love at the end of our show also to we'll share that information of how people maybe can access that. But I'm wondering, how have grief and healing influenced or shaped your identities?
Mm,
How has grief and healing changed you?
mm. In innumerable ways.
Mm.
Well, I think beyond that, although that is very true, I think it's, partly when I say grief is life affirming, I mean that it helps me feel like I'm connected to a life source and connected to the people and beings around me. And
Mm.
that's what's life affirming for me. And
Mm.
part of that has also helped me connect more to myself. A couple of years ago, I was given some new physical health diagnoses that are helping to explain some other symptoms that I've been having that aren't related to my other already known chronic conditions. And I am not like everything is like rainbows and parades all the time kind of person, or even like an everything
Mm,
happens for a reason kind of person. I'm more
mm,
of the it's happening, so what do we do with it kind of person, maybe going back to that practical piece. But I also think because of really truly because of my experience with grief and loss and my own experience with illness and the grief and loss that comes with that, a couple years ago, I just said to myself, this has to be an invitation. This has to
mm,
be an invitation for something else. And if I am so dedicated to being a caretaker for the people that I love in this planet in the ways that I can, I also need to save part of that for myself and see what kind of ways I can transform my life to both care for me better and not just save like the exhausted parts for my alone
yeah.
time, because sometimes I do that, but the vibrant, loving, caring parts
Mm,
also for myself, and knowing that we are only here for this tiny bit of time and we get to make
mm,
meaning out of our lives, whatever that might be. And I want that to be in alignment with who I am now and not just how I was raised or how I started being an activist when I did 20 years ago.
mm.
I'm trying to make my life work better for me so I get all of that good care and I can give all of that good care. And I think that's the only way I know how to answer that question right now.
No, I think that's so great. I'm glad that you shared that piece of like care is not only for others. I think as therapists that we make a living out, and it's in our bones and blood to care. A lot of therapists I know have become therapists out of their care for other people, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh,
And
we're
also,
terrible.
right?
We're terrible.
You know, we just care so much for other people that, you know, even like we struggle with, oh wait, I need to take a vacation. But like, will my clients be okay while I'm on vacation? You know, and like, am I allowed to care for myself in this way? And it's
Mhm.
funny. We laugh too at it because we're like, wow, what would we tell our clients? Yeah, take a
Mhm.
vacation, go on that, go, leave, you know? Um, or like if we're not feeling well or if we're sick, do we take the day off, right?
Mhm.
Do we have the privilege to be able to do that, right? Um, and thinking about caring for ourselves is also important as a carer for others. Carer, when you say carer,
Yes,
right?
terror, which is a hard word. And I will add this other piece in. I don't remember exactly who said it, but I attended this really great liberation psychology allyship with Palestinian workshop. I don't remember even the title of it. And someone said in there, self-care is not to feel better, it's to feel more connected.
Mm, yeah.
And I've really been trying to have that guide me, not
Mhm.
just in my own self, but also with the rest of everyone I'm on this planet with, every
Mm,
creature, every person. It's about more connection, not
mhm.
just feeling good or soothed.
Mm. How important, right? That like, how can we be connected with others if we're not connected with ourselves? Right? And so, like, I think there's just been so much you've shared about just like it can be daily, it can be routine to integrate, it can be daily, it can be routine to think about, ponder, be curious about life and death, be curious and ponder connection, yeah, with others, but also integrating what that means, living and dead, right? Or passed on into other spaces, right? Um, and so I'm wondering, as we sort of wrap up, a question that's come up with me that even helped sort of like spark this podcast in the first place was like, what do I wish people knew about grief, loss,
Mm,
and healing and identity?
mm,
Um, and So, as it pertains to this particular topic, as it pertains to processing sudden loss or processing loss of chronic illness, being a caregiver, um, reflecting about grief, um, what do you wish people knew about this? Or even, what do you wish you knew that you know now, but you didn't know before about this?
Hmm. Well, maybe, okay, it's all related, but maybe I'll do a two-parter. And one is going to be a practical piece, and one is
Mm,
going to be more really similar to what I've already said, but maybe I'll say it in a slightly different way. Grief is not an exception.
mm,
The times in life where we're not actively grieving, it's probably because we're not paying all that much attention to ourselves and to the world. Grief is not the exception. Grief is in the flow of life.
mm,
And maybe there's also a practical piece there too. I really do believe we need to find ways to make that true for us. Just like I'm always finding new ways. It's not as if I have arrived. I'm always finding new ways to make that true for me,
mm. Yeah.
both in my care for dear friends, the frog that I ran over on the road the other day, witnessing from afar genocide,
Mhm, mhm,
violence, all of that. Grief is not the exception, it's the flow of life. How do we be with that and flow with that? So that's one thing. And
mm,
then the other thing that I've learned more and more and more is how important it is for us to have those webs and networks of care built
mm,
into our lives. We are not isolated creatures. We are not supposed to be. The built world encourages that. I think a lot of people feel dislocated and disconnected, and
mm,
certainly I do also at times, even though I have a very vibrant, loving community of people and friends around me. We need each other.
mm,
We belong to each other. It's the time is now to be
mm,
making sure that you are fostering those networks, growing
mm,
them, building them with your neighbors, with your friends from across the world, however that looks, because this will be our lived experience together. It
mm,
will be illness, it will be death, it will be natural disasters all across the country right now that we live on now, right? Wrongly called the United States of America, all across the country, various natural
mm,
disasters occurring alongside people getting sick and dying, alongside violence. We need these networks. Build them each other. Just start. Tell people you're interested.
mm,
Ask people if they want to have a conversation about what that could look like. All
mm.
of that work and effort and the messiness of it means something and is practice and is
Mm.
necessary.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I I think if there's anything around good living and good death, I hope that we have good networks and good connection. Um, yeah. I appreciate you sharing so much of yourself. And I just wonder as we wrap up, if our listeners wanted to connect with you, if that's okay with you, how would you like them to connect with you and perhaps access those guides that you have written as well?
Well, only one guide is finished.
Okay,
The
thank
other
you.
one I am working. I have a website, which is my only intentional internet presence, which I barely maintain, but you can go onto it. It's my full name, Lizzie Anderson, Lizzie with an IE, Anderson with an SON.com. The guide is on there under resources. My email is there. I welcome communication, even if I am sometimes slow to return it.
Thank you. Thank
Mhm.
you, Lizzie. Thanks for your time today. Thanks for everything you've shared.
Oh, Dana, thank you and for your brilliance.
Appreciate you.
Appreciate you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Untethered to Rooted. Untethered to Rooted is produced and hosted by me, Dana Daugherty. Original music was composed and performed by the ever-talented Daniel Dickinson. Thanks so much to our guests for sharing with us today. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. And follow us on social at Untethered to Rooted. And if you didn't like it, what podcast? Dana who? Until next time, take and give good care.